Hello indie game fans, combat, ability unlocks and exploration forms the core of the Metroidvania experience, so here are 20 that have done it beautifully with some hidden gems you might not see coming. So let's begin with Guacamelee Super Turbo Championship Edition, one of my personal favourites that got me hooked on indie games all those many years ago. Our luchador protagonist and the lucha libre inspired moves and action are great, as is the Mexican theme and setting. Switching between the land of the living and the dead is another neat idea, applied in combat, exploration and even platforming challenges, and while there is a sequel, I still point people towards the first entry. F.I.S.T, forged in Shadow Torch, is a new entry to the list and comes out of PlayStation's China Hero project, in which they select and fund Chinese developers to make games for their platform, with this game being one of the major success stories. Set in a world of anthropomorphic animals under a dictatorial regime, our hero is a former soldier who fought in the Resistance War, now having to literally take up arms once again after his friend was arrested. The mechanical third arm takes three forms in the default fist, drill and whip, in which you can seamlessly switch between them for fluid combat and action, although the acronym is rather clunkily fit together. Still, it is quite a pretty game with a diesel punk world worth exploring, but it's certainly more of a combat-focused entry. Here's something very different in Monster Sanctuary, in that while, for the most part, you are platforming and using the ability of these monsters to access new areas, the twist is that combat is actually turn-based, so think of this as Pokemon, but as a side-scroller. I love monster taming games, so it's no wonder that this game spoke to me, with the different monster designs being interesting, and they even have unique specialized skill trees as well. The developers have supported this game post-launch with endgame content, so it's a massive package that is worth picking up. A number of you brought up Phoenotopia Awakening in the comments, and indeed, it was a game which I overlooked, where this 2D action-adventure puzzle platformer is kind of Metroidvania-ish, having more in common with Zelda 2 and Simon's Quest rather than the more modern definition of the genre, which makes it of interest because of that. A great starship appeared in the night sky and kidnapped all the adults, so our heroine, the now oldest member of the community, sets out to solve this mystery. It really does have gorgeous pixel art and environments, combined with decent combat, live sim elements like cooking and fishing, Ocarina of Time style flute playing, and so much more. The combat is fun and varied as well, so give this a go for a slightly different kind of experience that I think you will still enjoy. I thought that it was pretty interesting that Record of Lodoss War, Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth got made, since this is based on a classic Japanese anime series from the 1980s that was essentially Japanese Dungeons and Dragons, and somehow, miraculously, it got a video game in 2021 under Japanese developer Team Ladybug, who are known for this genre. More on them later. Deedlit is a high elf who wields a sword, daggers and bow used in combat and even puzzle solving, but from the movement of the character, you might think that this was Symphony of the Night, the classic game from the Castlevania series that spawned this entire genre along with Super Metroid. It is definitely more on the Castlevania end of things in terms of progression, in which you can level grind by killing enemies to become overpowered, but it's precisely that sort of power fantasy and progression that keeps this game interesting, not to forget the fantastic pixel art as well. Quick intermission here to see who watches the video in full, so check the comments for people mentioning why isn't Ori on the list. And yes, while Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps are gorgeous games which are great, Microsoft's involvement perhaps made it not so indie, not to mention reports of poor working conditions, so it gets a mention but isn't officially on the list. An example of the ingenuity of indie developers that I always bring up is Yoku's Island Express, a self-styled pinballvania with nothing else like it on the market. You play as a newly appointed dung beetle postman of Mokumana Island, having to deliver the mail to his residence, where the previous mailman decided to abandon the island due to something sinister awakening, so it's up to you to figure out what is going on. As the dung beetle, you're tethered to a boulder, which acts as the ball in pinball, in which the world is a series of interconnected pinball tables which is very cleverly made. There are also Metroidvania style ability unlocks, although the core gameplay is pinball, but is innovative and worthy of mention. One of the best games of last year is this classic Vania title, which is a subset of Metroidvania games which are more akin to older Castlevania games, in which our hero returns to his homeland to find it plagued by unholy magic, setting off on a quest to cleanse the corruption. The open world and non-linear structure is awesome, as are, curiously, player choices and multiple endings, with this getting support post-launch, such as with this co-op update, and is great. Here's a new entry from 2023 that must be played in Afterimage, a gorgeous hand-drawn title that is more realistic in proportions, set in the hauntingly beautiful ruins of a fantasy world. There's somewhat of a confusing plot and story of Goliaths and deities and the destruction of the heroine's village, which is perhaps the weak point of the game, where you do need to pay attention since the story will guide you along on where to go next. If you don't, the huge world is easy to get lost in, and I've seen play hours on this go into the 50+ hour range, so it's a meaty experience for sure. The combat is one of the main focuses, with great enemy designs and a variety of abilities at your disposal, and sure it's a pretty game to sink your teeth into. Here's something a little different in Astalon Tears of the Earth, since it features 3 playable characters but does have an interconnected world filled with secrets, which is the most important part of games in this genre. It has the 3 archetypes of warrior, archer and mage, who of course have unique abilities which allows you to access new areas, but you do need to return to a bonfire to swap between the characters, which makes exploration interesting. Our heroes are exploring a mysterious tower that appeared in the desert near their village, and have made a pact with the Titan of Death that enables them to grow stronger with every death, but is certainly not a roguelite. I love the 8-bit pixel art as well, which is probably no surprise since it's from the developer of Castle in the Darkness, which might end up on this list someday as the number of games grows. 2015, a full 13 years without a new 2D Metroid game, so as always, indie developers to the rescue with Axiom Verge, one that looks like a throwback to Super Metroid but has enough new changes to the formula that makes it their own. It's a typical sci-fi facility setting, but in which you are allowed to use glitches, both to explore the world as well as to corrupt enemies. Weapons have multiple functions and are used in clever ways, and while I would say that this has a relatively slow start, it's worth pushing through, and do note that while there is a sequel, I do still prefer the original. A game which I enjoyed very much is The Messenger, one that, on the surface, looks like another throwback title inspired by 8-bit and 16-bit classics like Ninja Gaiden, but it's so much more, since, minor spoilers, the trailer does show that you're able to switch between the 8 and 16-bit art styles, which is where it gets interesting. The boss fights are a challenge, and surprisingly, the writing is one of the most amazing that I have come across, and it's a really special game. So it was no wonder that their next game, the recently released Sea of Stars, had fan support and was well received, but is a no-brainer pick for the list. Here's a new entry to the list in the 2D Souls-like Metroidvania named Grime from 2021, which had a little bit of a rough launch due to technical issues, but that seems to have been largely fixed. Rather than the typical human or humanoid protagonist, you play as a living black hole with the ability to absorb your enemies through the parry, which is something that you need to master. The enemies are made of rock and root, which is atypical and gives it a very unnatural and unnerving feel, being a super strange and creepy entry. Furthermore, they have supported this post-launch with 2 major updates in Colours of Rot and Tinge of Terror, with a sequel in development as well. One of my favourite game universes to visit is that of the Steam World games, in which developer Image and Form have really made a name for themselves. But they did merge with Zoink Games to form Thunderful, which is a huge company with over 480 employees as of 2022, making them not so indie anymore, hence the asterisks, but they are pioneers in the space, and this game in particular is excellent. The original Steamroll Dig proved the concept, and the sequel expanded it in so many great ways, retaining the core gameplay loop of delving underground to mine until you were at capacity, then returning to the surface to sell, purchase upgrades, and to go back underground again, with upgrades that allowed you to carry more, mine faster, or to access new areas. You are on the quest to search for Rusty, the protagonist of the first game who has gone missing, with variety in biomes and enemies, which makes this fun. A game which might look questionable at first glance is Rabi-Ribi due to the aesthetics and character designs, since the main character is an anime bunny girl, but don't let appearances deceive you, this is one of the best Metroidvanias on the market, and can be quite the challenge as well, since it has bullet hell inspired combat. Our protagonist was a regular rabbit, but found herself in a strange new world with a new human form, partying up with a fairy and attempting to restore herself back to her normal body. But of course, enemies lie in between you and your goals. Impressively, this is what some consider to be a core facet of Metroidvanias in non-linearity of the world, in which you can explore in any direction and even allows for sequence breaks, meaning that you can skip over certain sections or bosses if you plan it right, being a surprisingly well-crafted game, so I would implore you to check it out, even though it's not the classic grimdark gothic horror kind of vibe. One of the long-running series in this space is Momodora, with Reverie Under the Moonlight being technically the fourth game, although no prior knowledge of the others is required. You play as a priestess wielding a leaf as a main primary weapon, fighting her way through the world to seek an audience with the queen to get help, so that you can destroy a great evil that is threatening everyone in the kingdom. Enemies here are some variants of goblins, imps, humanoids, monster girls, and gigantic bosses, having quite the variety which keeps things fresh. Speaking of combat, this is almost Souls-like in nature, with the lethal bosses and having to time your attacks as you dodge and get out of the way, with the boss fights being one of the highlights of the game. Like a couple of other games on this list, there is a sequel in development which I'm very excited about, so before that releases, check this out if you have not. An amazing Metroidvania that dropped a couple of spots is Ender Lily's Quietus of the Nights, since it comes to us from a pretty large Japanese corporation and is by no means a small indie team, but regardless, this game kind of came out of nowhere and is worth a play. Set in a world where a corrupting rain has twisted all that it touches into horrible mutants, play as a young woman enlisting the help of powerful fallen knights in order to battle enemies and to cleanse this twisted fairy tale world. Curiously, our protagonist cannot directly attack, instead summoning these knights when the attack button is pushed, for example, so there's a little bit of a disconnect that you need to get used to, with the other fallen knights first being bosses, which then get recruited to your side, forming the Metroidvania progression. I love the visuals in this, which, like F.I.S.T forged in Shadow Torch mentioned earlier, is simply gorgeous and I cannot miss. I'm still thinking about this one since Blasphemous 2 is the sequel to a beloved grimdark Metroidvania and is improved in many ways, with 3 weapons to choose from instead of just one from the first, and is a direct continuation of the story of the original game. It retains the signature pixel art look and the brutal execution animations as well, but perhaps has a little less variety in boss and enemy designs. You will face more humanoid and human-sized enemies as compared to the giant monsters of the first game, so the spectacle isn't there, although I do think that this plays better and might be supported with post-launch content if the first game is anything to go by. So for now, a tentative leaning towards the sequel. I like how Toho games have come to Steam in all sorts of different forms, since the Toho project is a largely fan-driven collection of novels, games, art and everything, sharing similar characters and settings but can be wildly different. For the most part, these are vertical shoot-'em-up games, but ever so often we get more mainstream ones like the Metroidvania Toho Lunar Nights. Our heroine Sakuya is a maid that throws knives with the ability to freeze time, finding herself in a strange new world with yokai and having to figure it out. You will see the return of fan favourite characters as bosses, but even with no prior knowledge, the game stands on its own, with the grease system being interesting, rewarding you with aggressive play from getting as close as possible to enemy projectiles and attacks, but not getting hit. The time stop ability is used cleverly in environmental puzzles and critically in boss fights, which are spectacles in their own right, with this coming to us from the developers that made Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth covered earlier. The man synonymous with the Castlevania series is Koji Igarashi, a fan favourite producer and director of those games in the past, and after the exodus of developers from Konami, which included Hideo Kojima, these developers often took to Kickstarter to fund spiritual successors to the games that they were known for, but without the IP. Another example being Yuden Chronicles and Suikoden, and that is the case here with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. This is about as Symphony of the Night as it can get in terms of gameplay, even having the whole inverted castle thing, which must have made the executives at Konami see red. And if you're not familiar, this game allows you to grind and level up, and you can become overpowered. I love the ability unlock system, which you get from shards harvested from enemies, with great combat and world as well. The 2.5D look isn't my favourite but did grow on me, but does have some immersion breaking things like including Kickstarter backer portraits in-game, but it does go to show the collective force of the gaming community in allowing developers like IGA to make something like this, and there are rumours of a sequel in development, although nothing has been confirmed. I won't labour on too long about this, but Hollow Knight is the indie Metroidvania that everyone points to, with it selling millions and millions of copies for good reasons, with the grim, ruined kingdom of insects being worth exploring, being equal parts terrifying and intriguing, which has led to Silksong being the most hyped indie game of all time, so look forward to that, where you can find more upcoming Metroidvanias in this video.